I really don't see Silicon Valley changing at all. I mean, I think we've seen good signs on their speech policies, but the bigger problem with these platforms, to me, has always been, I think, the biggest problem in American politics, which is that they are addictive. They are basically gamifying our politics. It's like if we were litigating important political issues through a digital casino. And that's so horrifying.
Welcome to the Unspeakable Podcast. I'm your host, Meghan Daum. I'm here in my makeshift studio. I'm still kind of finding my way back to life after losing my home in the wildfires here in Los Angeles, as I've been talking about. This is a conversation with journalist and political commentator Emily Jashinsky. But before we get to that, just a few very brief notes of housekeeping. If you want to become a paying subscriber to this podcast and find out more about what we're doing, you can go to Substack. You can get there directly by going to theunspeakablepodcast.com. You can also find out about the Unspeakeasy, my community for free thinking women and sometimes men. We have a thriving online forum as well as in-person retreats all over the country. We're doing several this year. So go to theunspeakeasy.com to find out about that. And now here's my conversation with Emily Jashinsky. Enjoy. Emily Jashinsky, welcome to The Unspeakable.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor.
You are a journalist and the host of Undercurrents, which is a podcast YouTube program produced by UnHerd, which is, I think, a favorite magazine media platform of a lot of listeners of this podcast, certainly mine. You're also the co-host with Ryan Grimm of Counterpoints. I've been really excited to talk with you because I think you are a notably sober and circumspect voice among the current crop of political commentators. So first of all, thank you for being that way.
No, thank you. I feel that way about you. So that's especially kind coming from you.
Okay. Well, I guess it takes one to know one. We're fighting the good fight. So I want to talk with you about a lot of things. But I mean, maybe first and foremost, what you are thinking about the future of the Republican Party and of conservatism more generally. I mean, I guess this is an obvious question, but it's obvious for a reason. And I'll start by asking you to self-ID for a second here. Do you identify as a conservative?
I do. And I think a lot of people have gotten uncomfortable with that label. But from my vantage point, it's the only honest way to sort of describe myself. You know, I'm sort of evangelical Christian. I believe that government should be limited to the extent that it's possible. But it's hard right now because I'm also sort of fiercely populist on economics. And, you know, I don't think it's super conservative to let trusts run amok and to, you know, abide by, you know, the economic policies just of the 1980s. So it's hard for me when you have the tech bros, as people have come to call them, come in and sort of hijack the Republican Party. Not that I've ever put much faith or stock in the Republican Party. I don't consider myself a Republican, but as the best vehicle for conservative ideas, it's hard to see what's happening. It's hard to know where it ends. So whatever that is, that's not my version of conservatism.
Okay, so that's interesting. You're a conservative, but you're not a Republican. So can you tell us a little bit about your background? I know you're from Wisconsin. I know you're very young. I'm not quite sure how old you are, but can you kind of just tell us your origin story?
Sure. Yeah. No, I'm 31. I was born in 1993, and grew up in the same little corner of the woods in Wisconsin that I was born in, and my parents still live there now, and it's a beautiful little patch of wilderness. But it's about 40 minutes outside of Milwaukee, so a beautiful little small town. And I ended up going to George Washington University for college. So I've been here in DC since the first Obama term, actually 2011. I moved here and never left. Started in the sort of conservative movement, working at a group called the Young America's Foundation, which was sending a bunch of speakers to college campuses at the time who were getting canceled and shouted down. I interned for Christina Hoff Sommers for a couple years in college and got to see some of that from her vantage point. And ended up at the Washington Examiner, then at the Federalist, and now at UnHerd. Did a show with Ryan Grimm over at The Hill. Then we brought it over to Breaking Points with Crystal and Sagar. So it's been about a decade of journalism, and the reason that I'm in journalism is the same reason that I don't think of myself as a Republican. Is that, like a lot of Americans, I just have a really hard time taking teams in the sort of, a lot of my friends.
I think
do it,
some
and I
Americans
understand.
don't have a problem with that.
No.
Let's just say, unlike a lot of Americans.
Oh,
yeah.
yeah.
Is that what you said?
Gosh.
Okay.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
Unlike.
Okay. I
Okay.
think it's just like a lot of people don't want to like put on a jersey right now, and a lot of people never did. But the two-party system, putting on a jersey for it is like, you're really always choosing between the lesser of two evils. Is kind of how I see it, and I feel like there are a lot of people who see it the same way. So I wouldn't want to be in government. I wouldn't want to be like working as an advocate for anything anymore, because just, I've been here since 2011, and just like the corruption is rampant, the sense of oligarchical control is rampant, and I've spent a lot of time in conservative circles, and I saw it before Trump, and I see it kind of creeping back into the picture, second Trump administration. So that's sort of where I come from, but it's all fun, at least, if you can laugh.
I think you have to. I think this is really important to lay out, because I have noticed that older people, they have a hard time sort of understanding what a new, younger conservative movement looks like. They associate the Republicans or the conservatives. Obviously, you're not a Republican, you're not identifying as such, but they're sort of, they associate that whole ethos with kind of older, fustier, kind of like Reagan era into George W. Bush era. And then, you sort of start talking about like how younger people are seeing things. And there's a kind of the Venn diagram between the Bernie bros and the sort of new young conservatives as you're describing them. I mean, there's some interesting overlaps there. And so, I mean, I'm wondering, like, what was it like for you, say, going to college? You came from Wisconsin. You're evangelical Christian. Were you like hanging out with conservatives when you got to George Washington University, or were you an outcast, or what was it like?
Yeah, I didn't go to college intending to hang out with conservatives, but it did just end up that way, which is probably an interesting lesson. I think that happened to people, especially young people who are younger than me, who ended up getting pulled into like actual politics on the right because of what they saw from the left on campus. So I got involved pretty quickly after getting to campus, was like active at the YAF chapter at GW, and it's sort of unpopular at GW to be ideological rather than political. So the college Republicans chapter, the college Democrats chapter, they're very popular, but the sort of ideological groups are less popular. So it was, though, oddly a good time, because it was the probably, as you remember, the rape culture, what I would say moral panic of the early 2010s, and that really gave way to cancel culture, or it was, I think, maybe the canary in the coal mine for cancel culture, like Gamergate days, all of that stuff. And then the month that I graduated, Trump descended from the golden elevator. So it was very much like, for me, I grew up in like the Tea Party era, and the reason that I was attracted to the Tea Party was, it's not because of any, like, I thought it had some great, economic proposals, but because it was a sort of a sentiment against elites. It was what I think a lot of people came to realize as the precursor to Trumpism. And I'm not like a big Trump backer, but I am like attracted to a movement that says you're being screwed over. Like after the recession, like you're getting screwed, whether it's Occupy Wall Street or the Tea Party. And so it was an interesting time, because at that moment it was manifesting in what was described as like the libertarian moment. I think on the cover of Time magazine, Rand Paul was on it. And I really liked that, because to me it was against crony capitalism. And that's still where I find myself. And that's kind of potentially the middle of the Venn diagram between the libertarian tech bros and the Trump Bannon populists, is against crony capitalism. But if Elon Musk is, I guess, the intellectual figurehead of that marriage, it's probably more complicated.
Yeah, we'll get to him in a minute. So you came to college in 2011. Okay, that's amazing, because that's right around the time when we started seeing the online feminism really
Mm-hmm.
change its tune. I've written about this a lot. You saw the Me Too, well, it wasn't quite the Me Too movement yet, but it was the campus rape culture. Suddenly the idea, you had the statistics floating around, 1 in 5 women will be assaulted on a college campus. It came from David Lisak, and he ended up retracting that statement famously, or actually not famously because nobody noticed. And then sometimes it was 1 in 4. Were you seeing that on campus? Was it one of these things where you're like, oh, I'm being told that things are the way it is, but things are the way they are supposedly, but then like what I'm seeing with my own eyes doesn't reflect this?
So I probably talk about this too much, but I actually worked for Christina for 2 years at the American Enterprise Institute. I just kept coming back. Like I was the intern they couldn't get rid of, but it was so much fun. There was 3 of us, her research assistant, me, and Christina. We had a blast. And to some extent, I was like, Christina has always had her finger on the pulse of what was happening in academia, but it was changing like in front of me. And I remember having all of these conversations about what was happening like at GW at that time. And, about the pronoun charts that were starting to take off at that time, how you
even at that time.
Oh yeah. It was interesting. And to the extent, like, I'm not interesting enough to have an origin story, but to the extent that I do, Christina would fact check every year. Basically, she would write for like Time or The Atlantic about the pay gap statistics. And
yes,
so I would go, because the American Association of University Women, I think it was them, put out a report every August, I believe. And every August you would flip to the back of it and you would see them just in tiny, like small print at the back of the report, talking about how if you control for all factors, this pay gap that they have been hysterically crying about for the entire report, it shrinks to like 93% or like 95%, whatever it was. And I was just like looking at the media coverage of the pay gap and then looking at the back of the report that they're covering. And I'm like 19, 20 years old. I'm like, what the hell is going on? Like, this is outright misinformation. Like, this is not true. All you had to do is go to the back. Are you intentionally not reading the report? Is this like just bad journalism? Is it narrative? I mean, it was just such a wake up call. And then you would see it repeated all the time, like professors. He's paying a stupid amount of money to go to the school, and the professors would say the same thing. And if you didn't agree, you were a bigot. I remember we brought Phyllis Schlafly to campus, and this is 2012, and she was 89 at the time, being escorted down this tiny hallway at GW. And the leftist protesters lined the hallway and were so close to her face. I mean, just like physically intimidating her. It was bizarre. She was cheerful through the whole thing. But for me, it was shocking to see how cruel and like just insane. I mean, it just seemed like cruel isn't the right word. It was unhinged, I think is probably the best word. There was something emotionally unhinged about the response.
Yeah, and such a lost opportunity too. I mean, those campus incidents where they, especially back then when there was less sort of social media component and they weren't necessarily doing it for the Instagram likes, they were like, shouting down and canceling really amazing speakers. Like I remember Rutgers, I think Condoleezza Rice, I think was the commencement speaker at Rutgers. And I don't know if she ended up canceling. I could be wrong on this, but I remember, and, I think, was it like, somebody, the woman who was the head of the IMF for a long time, was the speaker. I think at Smith College, and they didn't like her. And I'm thinking, like, you've got this is like a real get, like whoever booked these speakers, and what a lost opportunity there. So yeah, you worked with Christina Hoff Sommers. I believe it was on the re-release of The War Against Boys. Mm-hmm. So you were the fact checker. So that book originally came out in 2000. I think the re-release came out in 2013, somewhere around there. So, and that's a book that was really ahead of its time because it was about what we now call the masculinity crisis, this data showing that boys have a harder time doing the things that are necessary to succeed in academic environments as they now exist, sitting still, sitting in front of, well, they're pretty good at sitting in front of screens, but just, less time for physical activity. All of these things, though, are pretty familiar data points now, were pretty novel back then. So as you were working with her, was this new to you, or did it seem like common sense?
Yeah, it seems like common sense. And that's what's sort of funny about, I think, this will be very, very true of Gen Z. I think millennials were maybe the first generation because of social media where the rate of change became almost unmanageable. So to me, all of this was like really obvious because you saw it all around you. But I think to a lot of people outside the millennial generation, it was, I don't know. I mean, unless you'd read Christina's book in 2000, you may not have realized how it had actually gotten worse. And I remember I was going through, my job was to look at some of the studies from when the book originally came out, so late 90s, and make sure that they weren't being misrepresented, that there wasn't anything that had changed since then. And a lot of it really had gotten worse, and that was sort of eye-opening. But to me, it was just like reading the research that explained what I had always seen around me. And I think probably a lot of people my age would have the exact same experience if they were in my position, because it was just like, yeah, this is this is totally true, 100%. So that was a very interesting time. By the time I was leaving the AEI internship, Gamergate was starting up, and that was another thing that Christina saw before a lot of other people. And I think some people were frustrated. I think some people, because Christina's such a serious and sophisticated scholar, some people were like, well, why are you getting involved in this? It was, I
Yeah.
think, fairly obvious. It was like, because this is like, if we don't deal with this, men are going to get worse.
Okay, I am one of the, I think, majority of people that could never understand what Gamergate was
Mhm.
about. And we don't need to derail this whole conversation, but can you, like, in very concisely and quickly, give us the thumbnail on Gamergate?
Basically, video games were starting to go woke before woke was the way we described some sort of maybe like excessive leftism or radical cultural leftism. And the male video gamers had a total culture war. Like they waged Pickett's charge in the culture war, basically against the wokeification of video games.
How were they woke, though? What did that look like?
It wasn't like, I mean, to my memory, there were gaming journalists, like female gaming journalists, who were complaining that the games were like toxically masculine and were trying to change them, and they had a certain amount of pull in the video game community.
Okay.
And so they just sort of felt like it was being forced on, these men felt like something was being forced on something they love. The media was taking the side, of course, of the feminists. So it was like I do agree with people that it is a sort of early dust up in the Trump culture war that, I probably wouldn't have paid attention to it either if I didn't have to at the time. But if you look back on it, it's like, wow, all of the elements were right here.
Okay. And Brianna Wu, who's now
Mhm.
very vocal in the political scene, was a key player in Gamergate.
Early, yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, that's a separate conversation. But did you have friends in college? Like, were you considered an outcast? Were they taking back the night against your presence? What was your kind of positioning on campus?
No, it's funny. Yeah, that I did have friends in college, and most of my friends actually were definitely not conservative. Although one of my friends in college is still my best friend. She was like one of the few conservative friends that I had, but most of my friends were not conservative. And that was what made it really hard when, as I was graduating, this was like how I ended up working at Young America's Foundation. Basically, the student administration, which I would never have paid attention to for any reason, passed some type of bill mandating pronoun trading as part of a diversity training for if you were the head of a student group. Like, yeah. So the student newspaper called me up and asked if YAF would want a like religious exemption to that, and I was like, sure. It doesn't sound very tolerant of my beliefs or whatever. So that blew up into a national news story, and it was insane. But that was like the hardest point. It was right as I was graduating, because all of my friends, the LGBT student group on campus, said that we had committed an act of violence against the transgender community, that we were bigots. They, suggested we be pushed off campus. I think in the statement they put out, they were mentioning like comparisons to ISIS. Like, it was just the stupidest, like most 2015 like campus story ever. But that was the hardest part of it, was everyone suddenly turning, like friends you'd had forever who were like LGBT, and then being like, whoa, hey, I didn't know I was friends with this like secret bigot the whole time. And that pressure was really, really tough. It was emotionally really, really tough.
Yeah. I mean, had you been in a very conservative environment, like in your childhood and adolescence, in high school?
I mean, my parents weren't super political. My dad is like a union independent. He'll vote probably, I don't know. I don't know if he votes more Republican or Democrat, to be honest with you. And my mom's, normal, like Wisconsin Christian Republican. But it wasn't super like political or anything. I didn't grow up evangelical. I grew up Lutheran, like normal Wisconsin stuff.
Oh, okay.
So
Okay. Sorry.
yeah.
I didn't mean to. For some reason, I
Oh
feel
no,
like
no,
I read that
I
you
go to
were evangelical.
No, I go to evangelical, non-denominational, like rock band church now. But
Okay. Got it.
my parents are like a little bit more conservative, so it wasn't.
Mainline. Okay.
Yeah, but it wasn't like nothing like, I wasn't homeschooled.
What do you think it is about you that made you able to stand up to that? I think this is such an important thing to think about. When we do our unspeakeasy retreats, and you're going to be a Zoom speaker, you're going to be an unspeaker in our online forum coming up soon here. One of the things that we talk about at the end of each retreat is this question of like, why we are the way we are. Like, why is it that some people, and especially women, because I really think women, it's hard to go against the tribe. Like, there are all kinds of evolutionary reasons not to go against your tribe, just as a matter of survival. And there's a certain kind of personality profile that really rubs against that. And I think we who have that personality profile over index for this kind of intellectual space. What do you think it is about you that allowed you to get past, the kind of pushback that you got back then, and really forge a path here?
I'm so curious what answers you get to this question. I think that's a really good question to ask. For me, I think it's similar to a lot of people who go into politics and journalism. Is I'm sort of obsessive about making sure that everything I say is right, or everything I believe is right. So if someone tells me I'm wrong, I'm kind of obsessively trying to prove to myself that I'm right, or that I am wrong. Like, I don't want to ever say something wrong, and I don't want to ever believe something based on things that aren't true. So I'm sort of just always, because of that, skeptical and curious. And so when that came to me, like people were saying, "Oh, you're so horrible," whatever. Like, I really thought about it, and I tried to prove the alternative. I tried to work backwards, prove that I was a bigot and a bad person. And when I couldn't, get to that point, because I obviously don't think it's true, that's what really, I can't stand being misunderstood. And I think that's one of those things that drives a lot of people. For me, that's one of the most frustrating things in the world. And you've probably had this experience too. It's the most frustrating thing about social media in particular, because so many people are not. If you were across the table with somebody who's calling you stupid on social media or whatever, you'd have a good conversation, but that's not how they use social media. And it may be how you wish they use social media, but it's not. So that really fuels me, is, getting to the actual truth. And I'm just sort of obsessed with truth. And not for any, I'm sure that's for some psychological reason. I'm sure it's because I have some type of personal, psychological attachment to it for whatever reason. But that is definitely the fuel.
Yeah, I think for me, I've said this before, I just cannot stand bullshit. I cannot stand, it goes beyond just lying, just kind of talking for the sake of talking, trying to fill the space, reading the room. That's a phrase that gets thrown around a lot now. And, it is actually, we're going to, now that we're in the DOGE Elon era, perhaps reading the room has more going for it than we previously thought. But, before all this, I couldn't stand when, people are like, oh, well, this commentator didn't read the room. Well, you're not supposed to read the room.
Right.
Like you're supposed to say what's in the room regardless. And so I really hate that approach to life. Well, okay. So you came into politics and journalism. You graduate in 2013 or
15.
2015? Okay, 20.
Yeah.
Wow, that was the moment
Yeah.
for the beginning of the craziness. That was absolutely I think that was like when things really took off. So what happened for you? Like, how were you thinking about politics? What did you think about your future just as a person in the world, a woman in the world, a truth teller in the world?
Yeah, I mean, I always wanted to be a writer, and so I was very happy that's what I ended up doing. That's still what I love doing. The media's really shifted to audio and podcasting and video, so that's totally fine. My favorite thing is writing, so I still love getting the opportunity to do that at UnHerd. So I was just like ready to kind of live the like urban writer lifestyle. But of course, I started Young America's Foundation in 2015. And I always say that every journalist kind of has a Forrest Gump story. They've sort of been through these interesting historical moments. For me, that was, you probably remember the BLM dust up at the University of Missouri. And that took off in the fall of 2015.
Oh, is this we need some muscle here?
Some muscle, yeah. Melissa
Click.
Yep. And when that was happening, I was at the Reagan Ranch, which YAF owns and operates. I'm still on the board of YAF, and with a group of students from Mizzou. And we were thinking, like, what would be a way to like just show other students how silly and ridiculous this protest is. They had some crazy list of demands that was actually really funny, if I'm remembering correctly. And so we were trying to just point out how insane it was that the school was indulging this. And we came up with the idea at the time of sending Ben Shapiro on an emergency campus lecture. And that snowballed into Ben he had been doing some campus lectures, but we then in 2015 and 16 started realizing that we could clip these little bits of Ben's exchanges with students. And this is not to like, everyone sort of figured this out at once. It wasn't any one person's genius, other than I think Ben being really good in those back and forths. We started to realize that people loved those. People on the left loved those. Like students on the left loved watching them. Students in the middle loved watching them because it was, whether you agreed with him or not, a viewpoint that you were not getting in school. And you weren't really getting from the media at the time because things hadn't fully splintered like they are now. So I was working on that, and it was really wild at the time to have this front row seat to how people in the early Trump era, when he was just running in the primary and people didn't think he was going to become president. And then after he did become president, like seeing the reactions of college students to that from the front row of the culture war was incredible. And it was for me, I still worry. Like people think, there has clearly been a vibe shift. For me, though, I feel like it's a vibe shift into like maybe like the sleeper cell era of wokeness, which is, I can't imagine some of these kids have truly been deprogrammed from thinking that it's an act of violence to disagree with someone on pronouns. To me, that's really, I could be wrong. To me, that's just really hard to believe because I saw so much of it. And I had to deal with so many of those students who were coming after other kids for just the silliest stuff.
That's interesting. So you think that they've just kind of gone underground for a while?
Not intentionally, like not as a strategic thing, but just, it's less empowering right now to kind of virtue signal about whatever it is, race, gender, sexuality. And so that it's not as much of a force in our culture. But I can see sort of the permission structure changing to the point where that becomes empowering and a real badge of sort of virtue signaling again at some point. And then the institutions like are back in the throes of this ideology. I don't know. It's just so hard for me to believe that all of these millennials my age in middle management now truly don't believe in this stuff anymore.
Because they were true believers.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's fast forward to 5 minutes ago, and where to start? Again, I really admire the way you parse what's going on. You're pretty clear about your own opinions, but you do not tolerate this foolishness and this trolling and the absolute chaos that we're seeing. Okay, let me just ask you this: like, how worried are you about where we're at?
I'm extremely worried, and I don't know what you think of this. I mean, I'm surrounded by people on the right who are so bullish right now, have been celebrating, popping champagne, partying in tuxedos here in DC for the last like couple of months. And for me, I'm looking at, social media, and like social media to me has always been not just social media, but also just like sort of American health and all of these, issues that are so deep and don't get solved with the change of a political party. Like for me, this conservative movement is rooted in, or for voters, is rooted in this reckoning with failure of our institutions. And I'm not actually seeing, from my perspective at least, a real effort to correct institutions outside of the federal government. I think it's important to correct the federal government and to do it responsibly, which is a huge caveat, as it turns out. But I think it's, I don't see um, like academia, like K through 12 education. I don't see that significantly changing. I really don't see Silicon Valley changing at all. I mean, I think we've seen good signs on their speech policies, but the bigger problem with these platforms, to me, has always been, I think, the biggest problem in American politics, which is that they are addictive. They are basically gamifying our politics. It's like if we were litigating important political issues through a digital casino. And that's so horrifying. And now conservatives are completely in bed with Silicon Valley. You don't hear any peep about, there's no criticism of Elon Musk for X being extremely addictive, for completely disrupting our politics. And I'm young, but old enough to remember what it was like before Twitter. And it was like the conversations were better. There've been some really good stuff that's come out of social media, and I think there's a way that we can have both worlds. But for me, I just think like normal life is better without exporting so much of our life into these digital platforms. Like I think, I don't know, somewhere like 5 years ago, I started to think, long and hard in ways I hadn't before about how social media social media on smartphones really changed everything for people my age. Like it was just such a disruptor, total pivot, like an absolute pivot in the course of life. And I just remember like there was a time when you didn't have, like, the way I started thinking of my cell phone is that it was always the best news of your life or the worst news of your life could be in your pocket at any given moment. So it's sort of rational to constantly be checking your phone in a weird way. Like we've been rewired to constantly be online because there's no escape from possibility and from that connectivity. So I'm like, I can't believe that we're just like not talking about any of that anymore. And conservatives were talking about it all the time before Silicon Valley went all in for Trump. So I still think that is the biggest problem in our politics. And I'm now probably more worried than ever because nobody's talking about it anymore.
When you say that there were really good conversations going on, what do you mean, for example? Do you mean still online, just not on Twitter?
Honestly, I think the days when it was like Andrew Sullivan, Ezra Klein, Matt Iglesias, and all kinds of people who had these blogs where they were still, Jonah Goldberg, they were still interacting with each other immediately, but taking more time because it wasn't like literally gamified to where the notification colors are triggered, are red to trigger certain reactions neurologically. I just think that pushed us to be more thoughtful, to be more decent. The algorithm now rewards extremism. I shouldn't say extremism, but like emotional extremism. It rewards like anger or whatever, outrage, or intense. The sort of intensity of opinion gets rewarded when we don't always have to be intense about certain things because they don't always demand intensity. But social media does. So, and it just because we're checking it, we're incentivized to weigh in. And if we're going to weigh in, then we're incentivized to weigh in with intensity. And so, yeah, I mean, I think we interacted better in person, but I also think our digital interactions were healthier too.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of the analogy I think of is if you're on YouTube, as I'm sure you know, there's like it is literally against the law not to have a thumbnail, a screaming thumbnail with some kind of extreme facial expression and hands waving around, and you own the libs or own whoever it is, and just like some incredibly incendiary, really cartoonish, tacky, in my opinion, graphic. And everybody says, oh, I hate it, I hate it, I hate it. But if I don't do it, literally nobody will watch my video. And I guess it's true.
And that's in the hands of one company. And this is another thing the right was talking about. And I always said, like, I gave a speech at the National Conservatism Conference a few years ago about how so many of the problems that the right is upset about are downstream of consolidation in the tech industry. And I was like, everyone, it was, we published it at Federalist, and I got a lot of feedback on it, and there was a lot of agreement with it. And now I'm looking around and I'm like, so nobody's upset that, like, Google is as powerful as it is. Nobody's upset that Elon Musk is as powerful as he is. I mean, I have come to see the world through the lens of, like, I guess digital technology being the, I used to see it as like postmodernism. I used to think postmodernism was the, what's the best way to put it? Like the poison pill. It was the well from which all of the, all of the problems that we were facing had evolved. It sort of came from that seed. And now I'm starting to think we actually could overcome the problem of postmodernism if we were having these conversations on, like, in normal human spaces, if it wasn't this like extra human technology that's allowing us to communicate with people who are thousands of miles away, who we will never meet, whose life stories we don't know. And so as I started to see things that way, I never have been able to unsee it.
And what do you think the incentive structure is? Because I'm a little skeptical when I hear people say, well, Elon Musk just wants to enrich himself. This is all about money. I mean, he's already the richest man in the world. Like, Jeff Bezos, is he really out to enrich himself? Like, or, maybe he is, but let's take Elon, for example. I think he has like really big ideas about changing the world. I mean, this is a guy who wants to go to Mars. I don't think it's about like making more money at this point. What do you think?
I agree with that completely. Like, there's a lot of talk right now about Starlink and the FAA, and these like small conversations about whether it's going to get a government contract. But I think the conflicts of interest aren't fair. Probably other people don't get that type of advantage. All of that, sure. But I think what he wants is his companies to be successful, because I think he's set up his companies in a way to sort of advance his ideological vision for the world. And I think it's entirely sincere. I don't think it's BS at all. I think he really does believe that humanity will be better served by Neuralink, by occupying Mars. I mean, I think it would be crazy to think it wasn't sincere. This is like, this man has put his whole life into it. He puts every breath into it. I think he's very clearly a genius. So in a way, to me, I think that's actually better than being fully profit motivated, because that means you can like actually try to convince him of something. You can't convince someone out of, if it's all avarice, you're not going to convince someone unless it's like you have a Dickensian intervention with Ebenezer Scrooge that comes from, God Almighty. You're not going to convince someone that they would be better off if they made less money. But because it's ideological, I think he's a little bit more malleable.
So, but what do you think is going on with him right now? Like, just in terms of his role in the government and DOGE and everything that's going on? Is he just like a sleep deprived? Is he in like a prolonged, protracted manic state? What's up?
This is what actually kind of concerns me, because even for Elon Musk, I mean, many things concern me, but even for him, this is, I can't imagine that he's ever had anything this stressful, demanding, and serious in his life on his plate. I can't imagine that any human has ever had the task of managing Tesla, Starlink, Neuralink, like X, all of these insane, SpaceX, all of these insanely powerful companies, in addition to a quote revolution, as he puts it, in the federal government in the United States. I mean, I think it's that in and of itself is terrifying. The fact that he has 2 babies in the last with 2 different women in the last 6 months.
Yeah, I feel like such a sloth. I don't know about you.
Right?
I don't
And the
get
women are
anything
like,
done.
the women are publicly feuding, and it's affecting the politics. Like it's a mess, and that is concerning in and of itself. Even if you grant that he's a genius, even if you grant that he is genuinely like ideologically committed to what he sees as bettering humanity, from everything we can tell from the outside, there's no sort of like he's gotta be drained. He's gotta be like in some ways irrational. I just that's
Well,
another
he's
thing.
clearly irrational. I mean, that's not. I don't think this is up for debate.
Yeah.
I mean, and what's your interpretation of the relationship between Musk and Trump?
So I've heard an interesting conspiracy theory that I actually think is compelling, but I will preface this by saying it is a conspiracy theory that Trump's meme coin is held by a few whales, and we don't know who they are. And it's possible that Elon Musk is one of those whales, or is sort of adjacent to one of those whales, and everyone's kind of aware of what's going on, and that's why Donald Trump is much more lenient with Musk than we saw him be with, for example, Steve Bannon. When Steve Bannon got that, I think it was a Time magazine cover and started getting a lot of attention, Donald Trump was clearly irked by it, and that led to Bannon's ouster. People around Trump have long been sensitive. They really believe that's true, that he doesn't want to have it look like anybody else is the mind behind Donald Trump, or is the brains of the operation, or is the indispensable person. He's the indispensable person. So I do think that's very, very interesting. I also think Elon Musk poured a truly insane amount of money into the presidential election, like money that is unbelievable. And he mobilized the state of Pennsylvania, basically helped seal the deal for Trump. And so to some extent, the nakedly transactional Donald Trump is behaving exactly as you would expect him to be, which is he is in a transaction with Elon Musk. Elon Musk is enormously enormously powerful is what I meant to say. His like Starlink has affected the wars in Israel, in Ukraine. Like it's part of the war effort in both cases. Musk is just such a powerful guy that even as president of the United States, Donald Trump has to play nice with him, even beyond the transaction. So I don't think you even need a conspiratorial explanation, even though maybe there's something to that. But it's just, he's so, so powerful that even the president of the United States can't really afford to, push him aside.
But for how long? Because Donald Trump does not like this kind of competition. I mean, I don't see this lasting the year, to be honest with you.
Mm-hmm. I know. And I also wonder if Donald Trump seriously considers when some people like Steve Bannon or guys at CPAC are suggesting that he run for a third term, if he wants to keep Elon Musk around in order to basically secure a third term. If Elon Musk can pour a bunch of money into the race again, maybe that's partially why Donald Trump has been so lenient towards Elon Musk. It seems to me inevitable, and I think to all of us, it's like on paper this seems impossible. Like, how is this relationship still going even now when Elon Musk has fired and rehired veterans, national parks? There's everyone sort of expected, even on the right, and everyone in this project was like, this is going to be a mess. We know it's going to be a mess. They're sort of like, ends justify the means. This is such an important project that you have to do it rapidly. And it's going to be kind of a mess. Otherwise you're never going to get it done. But even then, I mean, it's like the VA stuff, that has just been a mess. And I think it's only going to get worse. So it does seem to me untenable, but at the same time, they both have so much on the line, that I wonder if maybe they can defy our expectations.
Do you believe Elon Musk when he, for instance, I don't know if apology is the right word, but when he says, okay, well, we did make a mistake here, for example, I think with the US AID, okay, we didn't mean, we did take a sledgehammer to this and we meant to use a sledgehammer, but we didn't mean to cut the Ebola funding. Oops, okay, we'll put it back. Like, how genuine do you think that sort of thing is?
I actually think part of his genius is a media genius. And I think it's just because he's so online. And if you've been so online for the past 10 years, you probably saw this coming, which is that people value transparency now more than they value neutrality. So they don't need, or like the sort of, or bona fides, like they don't need you to be the best person to do any given task. Or they, I mean, maybe they would prefer you to.
Well,
but
they don't like experts, I guess, as much
don't
as they
like
used
experts. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah, don't like experts. And what they value even more than expertise is people who are like owning up to their mistakes, because people feel like they've been lied to so much. And I think he understands that, and I feel like he's on his X feed. This is another thing that concerns me about this man. Nobody should post as much on social media as he does. Like, absolutely nobody. It's completely insane, psychotic, and unhinged.
I mean, it makes Donald Trump look like very ginger in his tweeting.
Yes,
extremely.
It's truly insane, let alone somebody who's in charge of so many important things at any given moment in his life. Like, it just seems bananas. But yeah, I actually think he does understand that he's probably better off. Trump understands this too, I think, in a way. He's better off almost approaching the world of politics as reality television, because it puts you ahead of people who are still play acting as West Wing. Like, to just own it as Veep puts you ahead of the people who are LARPing as West Wing.
Okay. All right. Wow. There was a lot in that last couple of sentences. So we've got like West Wing would be like 1.0. Well, I don't know. Maybe like All the President's Men is like 1.0. Yeah. West Wing. So depending on how far back you want to go. So we West Wing, Veep, reality television. But now we have these meme wars. Everything is a meme. Everything is a vibe. And I'm really wanting to know what you think about this, because I'm a Gen Xer. I'm watching people like Musk, JD Vance, people in leadership positions, as close as we have to the quote unquote adults in the room, acting like trolls. I mean, just acting completely juvenile, absurd. They're in the Oval Office, yet they're acting like they're in their parents' basement. And this is just an accepted kind of discourse. And maybe we are shaking our fists at clouds saying, well, this is inappropriate. This is not how we do things. What about our norms? But like, is this just the way things are now? Like, have we really just sort of replaced substance with vibe?
Oh man, I feel like we're heading in that direction, because what concerns me is that I think you're right. Like, some of it is, your old man shakes fist at cloud, because what I see among people who are even younger than me is they just want to see things as they are, like primary sources. They want that linked. They want to read it. They want to whatever. They want to see the actual interaction. They want to, hear the actual audio. They actually kind of expect that because they're so used to seeing the world play out as it does. There's cameras everywhere now, so they're just so used to seeing the real story, not the kind of edited nightly news Cronkite version of what happened. They just want the raw footage because they're so used to it. And I think where that leads is people who still try to there's a really good, this is what concerns me, is there's value in the pretense sometimes, right? Like it's even with like the United States, the way the president of the United States comports himself and the way the president of the United States talks to other world leaders. Like, I still think there's value in that. But I think younger Americans are less convinced that that's true, because all they've seen is people who put on that act being untrustworthy. So they associate the act itself with untrustworthiness, which means you're just throwing the baby out with the bathwater. The bathwater is the untrustworthiness, but there was always something good about that itself, because it was aspirational. This is the aspirational position of the United States, of this world leader, whatever. Like the Marco Ellis kid who JD Vance brought back in, or convinced DOGE to bring back in after he had posted like normalize Indian hate and blah, blah, blah. And Vance sort of framed this as just pure cancel culture. And I like JD Vance, by the way, but he framed this as just a pure act of cancel culture. It's like, he posted that stuff in September. It wasn't when he was like a 12-year-old fooling around. Like, this was like 3 months ago. Like, what are you talking about? That to me felt like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Like sometimes there are consequences for trolling and shit posting. Like
Yes.
I get that he's trolling, but it's still not okay to publish. Like maybe say that at a bar with your friends if you're joking, whatever. You published that on social media. It's insane.
Okay, is it because they don't go to a bar with their friends? Because this is the
Maybe.
thing. I feel like they live online. This is where they live. If it's either like you're either to troll is to speak. Okay, like there is no other space.
Copyright that. That's brilliant.
Because there really is no other kind of like language landscape. Like everything is taking place here. I mean, JD Vance, again, I think he's really smart. I want to believe that he's like playing some long game and he has really innovative ideas and he's willing to speak honestly about what the problems are. I think what he says about American families is important and interesting, potentially, useful, potentially. But I can't stand the way he kind of just like allows himself to sort of roll over into this really ugly space. And I get that that's sort of part of the vernacular of his social world, but he should know better. And I guess I just don't, I don't understand. I worry that like what I'm asking for is just irrelevant.
Yeah. And, I actually worry about that too, even as I talk to some of my friends on the right, like people I know who are really hardcore Trump people. Some of them are absolutely fantastic people. They love the country. They want it to be better for everyone. But they've come up with, since the especially Flight 93 election essay by Michael Anton in 2016, shortly before the election between Trump and Hillary Clinton, they've accepted a totally Manichaean framework of politics, so with us or against us, and that's not historically unusual. But I think what's interesting about it is that I just don't believe that's often true. I think that mentality allows it allows something to, what's the best word, metastasize. It prevents you from sort of self-correction. I think there's way too much like the David French posturing against the right. I think there's too much of that, and I get why it angers people in Trump world. It's like, well, we don't have to hash all of this stuff out in public New York Times op-eds. But also, if you're pushing everybody out as an enemy and you have total trench warfare mentality, which they defend, that they wouldn't deny that that's what it is. They just disagree with me on whether or not it's helpful. I think the problem with that is you end up not having good faith critics inside your circle. You've purged everyone who could be a good faith critic because you're applying these litmus tests of who's on the team and who's against the team. So that to me is one of the biggest problems here, is that I think JD genuinely, like in good faith, believes the best thing for the country is for the right to have a trench warfare mentality. Otherwise, it gets infiltrated by people who seek to prevent the project of correcting our institutions. You get the old institutionalists who will corrupt the effort. And I just disagree with that. And I think we see a lot of it. I think maybe the experiment is still playing out. Maybe that's their best case scenario, but I just don't agree that it's a good way to go about politics.
Yeah, well, we saw it happen on the left. I mean, nobody who was like a thoughtful, nuanced person wanted to get involved, or they were just pushed out. I mean, I've said this a million times. If the smart, thoughtful people don't speak up, the stupid, thoughtless people are going to do the job. And it's almost like if the smart people were smart enough to know to keep their mouths shut. I mean, that's what happened with so much of this like regressive, cancel culture stuff, is because the majority of people actually do have reasonable opinions. But there was no point. Like they were disincentivized from speaking up because the social penalties for doing so were so great. I really worry that, thoughtful conservatives are being completely pushed out of this arena.
And I think people sort of on the left need to be careful to not associate. Like one of the weird things about X is, it's not weird, it's totally like logical when you think about how it's designed. But since Musk took over, it changed the speech regulations and everything, which by the way, I think is probably for the better. the problem is that people make this mistake of saying, because there's a small, tiny minority of literal neo-Nazi stuff that gets published on X, which I have never seen as much of it in my life, but it's always from a small
I feel
group
like
of
it's
people.
all I see. Well,
I
because
know,
I
it's
engage
insane.
with it. That's the problem.
Right. No, same. Because I'm like, what are you guys saying? And it's clearly like, it's always from the same people. It's the same small group of people on X. And it's not fair to associate that with the sort of average Trump voter. And the right was making the case, because I remember I was making it in the pages of the Federalist, that it was wrong to associate the insanity on Twitter with the average Hillary voter or the average Biden voter.
Yes.
Like it wasn't.
Yes.
It's the consequences of that rhetoric are real. It was changing corporate behavior. It was changing the culture, but it was only changing it because it was interpreted as representative of some broader group, and it's not. And so I think it's dangerous to allow our minds to be infected with the disproportionate volume of things that we see when we live on X as journalists, as people in media, as people interested in politics. Almost all of us, we're a small group of the country still, but we just it's so easy, even if you're conscious about it, to say like, oh my gosh, the rise of neo-Nazis has begun because they're all over X, and that's just going to make the right dig in deeper and deeper, because they have to purge people who are going to accuse them in a couple of months of being literal neo-Nazis. So it's a really vicious cycle.
Yeah, I just did an interview with River Page, who wrote a piece for the Free Press about is the online right building a monster, and he was really able to articulate, this very phenomenon that you described that I've been observing for a long time, but I could never quite figure out, like, are these real people? Are they bots? Are they teenagers? And he thought more of them were adults than I wanted to think, anyway. But
I think that too. I just still think it's a small, like, I think there are too many people, for example, on the left, who were making these arguments that to disagree with the BLM movement means that you're categorically racist, or to vote. This is an argument we saw a lot, is to vote for Donald Trump means you're categorically perpetuating racism. I think there are too many people in the country who believe that. I just still think they're not the majority, not even a plurality. So it's just unfair to kind of affiliate that with the average.
So speaking of that, the other night, maybe it was even yesterday, you posted on Twitter that you thought that a conversation between Tim Dillon, the comedian, and Steve Bannon was the most important political discussion to listen to this year. It was something like that. If you listen to any political discussion, make it this one. And I did. I watched it last night. It was super interesting. It made me a little scared because it made Steve Bannon seem very reasonable and even charming, which I guess this is not. Many people already had that feeling about him sometimes, that he's charming anyway. It was not my that had not been my. I did not anticipate feeling that way. Why do you like that conversation?
I think people underestimate, and this is just sort of the nature of the way the media is set up, and is very sort of heavily coastal. But I do think people underestimate the extent to which the project of Trumpism has its origins in something that is really noble and virtuous, which might sound funny, but I think if the average person listens to Steve Bannon talk to Tim Dillon, it sounds totally common sense and rational, and like it's rooted. If you had no idea who Steve Bannon was and you just listened to what he was talking about in terms of starting with the Great Recession, I think one of the reasons I really love that podcast is they start with the Great Recession and how it affected the left and how it affected the right, and how it, because of the way it was affecting regular people, and you just sort of build from that point. That's sort of like the seed from which the populism grows. And obviously people will say, there are things that go back even further, and I agree, but like really we saw two very direct offshoots of that seed of the recession. We saw Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party. The Tea Party keeps growing and becomes a Trump movement. Occupy sort of grows into the Bernie movement. DNC cuts Bernie off. But other than that, I mean, the Republicans couldn't cut Trump off. So here we are. And I thought that I think that the way too many people see the project of Trumpism is that it's, if you separate Trump from Trumpism, is that it's cynical and is necessarily racist or it's fully reactionary. And actually, there are people, this is what we were talking about earlier, like what drives me. It just gets so frustrated when people misunderstand things. And I just know so many people who have extremely intellectual, deeply rooted, and virtuous justifications for why they changed the Republican Party, for why they support Donald Trump. And I'm not a big Trump person, but I think we have to have an accurate understanding of what's going on behind the scenes. And I feel like Tim Dillon was able to really pull back the curtain in a digestible way and sort of see the Wizard of Oz version of Steve Bannon, as like there's something highly rational and decent. And even if you don't believe Bannon is sincere, the way he articulates and expresses it, I think is exactly what so many people miss about Trumpism. And I just thought that conversation, for whatever reason, maybe Tim's background in finance, but it just captured something that was a much more accurate version of what was going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, and I was remembering how Errol Morris, who's one of our most celebrated documentarians, beloved by elites and the left, was pretty well canceled for doing a documentary about Steve Bannon, and was like, I think he talked about actually being suicidal as a result of that. Like his, career was pretty damaged, pretty profoundly damaged by the fact that he made this documentary. It didn't show up in any film festivals, and I don't think most people have seen it as a result. But Tim Dillon can get away with it on YouTube, but
I have a funny
Errol
story
Morris
about
cannot.
that. So I was at a screening of the Errol Morris documentary in DC that was all Beltway journalists, like no conservative journalists. I got it. It's a long story of how I ended up there, but I remember my friend was like a mainstream media journalist at the time, came in and we like bought a bottle of wine, and we thought that the things Bannon was saying was like the funniest stuff. Like it was because it was like 2017 and everyone was so self-serious and Bannon was so politically incorrect that we were, we'd had a couple glasses of wine. We were like laughing through the entire documentary when Bannon would say something funny, and it was not treated kindly by the other journalists in the room who felt like this was the evil genius and had no interest. I mean, they wanted to watch a movie that slammed him, and I think Errol Morris actually captured not the most positive version of Steve Bannon.
I think Errol Morris was probably trying to slam him, but just the fact that he platformed him at all was the problem.
Right. They didn't want the 3D version of Steve Bannon. They wanted the 1D version of Steve Bannon, and Morris captured him in all of his dimensions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, okay. Just to wrap up here, we're recording this on March 3rd. God knows what's going to happen. It's Monday. God knows what's going to happen by Monday afternoon. It's Monday morning on the West Coast. What do you think? What? I want to hear your worst case scenario and best case scenario for what's going on now. Like, what are you afraid is going to happen, given the players and what they're executing?
Great question. I guess, well, there are a lot of worst case scenarios given that Elon Musk has, there's like nuclear powers.
Right. There are many tentacles here.
Yeah. There's 2 kinetic wars, and Elon Musk himself is, has all kinds of defense capacity and everything. So I think the worst case scenario is, as per usual, but probably heightened, a nuclear catastrophe spinning out of control. I remember when Trump first tweeted about the size of Kim Jong-un's button, I was at a friend's house in Capitol Hill, and this was pretty early into Trump 1. I remember being like, okay, this could be it for us here in DC. And then we all kind of became numb to the way Trump negotiates and operates, and probably correctly. But you still, the world is like incredibly unpredictable, and Trump is incredibly unpredictable, and Elon Musk is actually pretty unpredictable too. So I think the worst case scenario, honestly, is like a hot war, a hot war that involves American troops directly. Obviously, Taiwan is a serious question here. Elon Musk has all kinds of relationships with China. So who knows what happens? I think that's the worst case scenario. I think more in terms of like domestic politics, worst case scenario is that Musk further he doesn't correct the problem of institutional distrust. He exacerbates the problem of institutional distrust by actually worsening the institutions, not bettering the institutions. But I actually think that could potentially be the best case scenario too, is that he genuinely corrects these institutions. And I feel like we're right in the early stages of the experiment. And that maybe there is a streamlining and the institutions respond. Like academia, there's some signs that they realize that they've erred and they're going to, get better, that they've gone too far. They're not going to become Hillsdale en masse, but like they're going to realize that like maybe they should stop building lazy rivers and stop letting people who are like Angela Davis, giving them tens of thousands of dollars in speaking engagements and all that sort of thing. So I think that's also the best case scenario, but I just feel like right now we're in the middle of the experiment. And one of the things I appreciate about you actually is a sort of like recognition that we don't have all of the answers right now. That's just also sort of how I feel. Like these things it's so unpredictable.
Yeah. Well, many things are true, right? That's always the answer. Many things are true, and we can never know. But the algorithm does not favor either of those statements. So, the people who make them are shouting into the wind.
And they're responsive to the algorithm. So.
Yeah. Well, Emily, I'm just a huge admirer. I cannot thank you enough for the way you're going about things, and just you're incredibly insightful and informed. And it's just, it's a real gift to have you on the scene. So thank you for talking with me. And I hope we can talk again.
It means a lot that you say that. So I appreciate it. And I really admire and respect you. Very much a mutual feeling. So thank you for having me.
Okay, thanks. You've been listening to the Unspeakable Podcast. To support the podcast, go to megandaum.substack.com or theunspeakablepodcast.com and become a paying subscriber. That gets you access to all of the episodes in their entirety, as well as to my writing and lots of other perks. You can also check out the Unspeakeasy, my free speech women's community, at theunspeakeasy.com. We have in-person retreats all over the United States, a membership-based online community, and also some stuff that includes guys, like courses and occasional co-ed retreats. And by the way, we often have guest speakers that have been guests on this very podcast. So check that out at theunspeakeasy.com. I will be back next week with another super nuanced guest. Thanks for joining me. See you then.